Okay. Well, this session is about how creative industries policy making has been taken up in developing countries, and while it's certainly true that the export of the basic template or package, CI policy making package with the British Council stamp on it, has been very rapidly exported and taken up around the world. It's obviously it's a different application or a different response in different countries, and especially among developing countries. But it's probably fair to say that it's among the most rapidly developing countries that you've seen an especial interest in creative industries policy making. Why? Because these are countries that want to move up the value curve, economically speaking, as fast as they can. They want to be in. They want to have a seat at the table in the knowledge economy, and they know that the competition there is for high-skilled talent. And if they want to compete, then creative industries policy making comes in a package as an industrial policy that looks as if it's relatively cheap and will enable them to compete. Many of them have already lost what manufacturing jobs they had to China and other places in East Asia, and so they're especially looking for ways of moving up the value curve. I'm going to be talking about China itself, and George is going to be talking about Latin America, or specific cases in Latin America. So we're going to try and be quite specific in the case studies that we present here. In China, there's a kind of zeal on the part of party cadres to compete in this field, because there's kind of national intensity, a nationalistic intensity involved in driving the economy towards the most prized IP fruit at the top of the value chain. And the biggest asset in terms of China is the capacity or the potential to monopolize or to capitalize on their monopoly of the Chinese language itself, as it's sort of extensively spoken globally, both at home and overseas. And the surest sign that PRC has joined the ranks of such nations that have adopted these policies is that in a number of Chinese cities in the course of 2006, the major Chinese metropolises, each of them incorporated creative industries policy into their 5-year plans. So it's now sort of official since 2006 in all of those cities. And the national level, although it took several years of very heated consideration, the party bureaucracy did accept, albeit cautiously, the creative industries concept and has fashioned policies accordingly to support its development. Now, even as we speak, we know the Olympics is going on, and the Olympics became a kind of premium vehicle through which to promote the success in developing China's creative industries policy making. It's interesting that sports as such usually falls outside of the purview of creative industries. There's no particularly good reason why that should be the case, because a lot of the elements that are involved in sports as a form of development are easy to equate with the usual package. I mean, we're talking about high-skilled talent and so on and so forth, but for reasons perhaps we could discuss here or elsewhere, they're not normally included. The Olympics is a different matter, however, largely because of its status as a driver, a kind of mega driver of regional development. And so we've seen a flood of statistics in China issued around the rollout of the Olympics over the last several years, statistics that are designed to support the claim that China's creative sector, the performance of China's creative sector, which was described recently by one official as the huge profit cake of the 21st century, is doing very well and has outpaced all other industrial sectors in recent years in China, which is a huge claim because, as you can imagine, the growth of all other sectors has been pretty formidable. Cultural industries policy making cannot survive without a regular intake of statistics. It sort of feeds off statistics. It's part and parcel of policy making. And so, but it's important to understand that no one in China believes any of the statistics that are generated by the central government, and there's no reason why anyone outside of China should do so either. Nonetheless, one interesting stat was last year the UN's Committee for Trade and Development, UNCTAD, released the results of a survey which was undertaken by a high-level panel on the creative economy that had been commissioned by the Secretary General. The survey showed that by 2005, which these are the data they collected, by 2005 the international trade in creative goods and services had reached something like $450 billion with an annual growth rate of 8.7% over the previous 5 years. China, to the surprise of many, had ascended to the top of the list of exporters of creative goods and services. Its 2005 exports were estimated at $61.4 billion, which was more than twice the volume of the second-place country, which was Italy, at $28 billion. And if you added in the Hong Kong numbers, the total would be $89.1 billion, which is just a huge chunk of that overall sum. Now, these numbers are impressive and were duly trumpeted by the national press in China, but the fact is that the lion's share reflects the impact of offshore outsourcing. Like a lot of these statistics that the central government and other agencies, like the UN, put out, they don't make any distinction between what is designed and created and produced indigenously and what is the result of offshore outsourcing. So the lion's share of this we've taken up by, say, a French fashion designer who decides to produce and assemble in China. All of the exports from those orders would be included in that total. So in other words, there's no effort made to figure out how to quantify exports whose design was of domestic origin solely. And in China's case, those numbers would be much smaller, reflecting the more sober reality of its long-standing cultural trade deficit. The fact is that most overseas investors are still quite happy to profit from offshore production in China, but are much more ambivalent about the prospect of aiding the transition from a labor-intensive made in China to an innovation-based, created in China economy, which would have very firm domestic control over things like patents and IP rights and so on and so forth. But the fact is, and it's difficult to dispute this, that is nonetheless the direction that the Chinese economy is headed in, very firmly steered by a powerful centralized state authority, which is firmly committed to the policy of techno-nationalism that had its origins well before the reform era in the decades of Mao's nation-building era. Now, up until recently, this nationalist drive has been more fully apparent in high-tech sectors. You have the national innovation campaigns in the high-tech sector in the 1990s, which saw the establishment of a wave of science and technology parks, and companies with a large-scale capitalization, both state and privately financed by overseas investors, were offered a whole raft of very generous tax protection and generous aid packages to locate there. And foreign expertise and industrial knowledge were very closely courted in these locations. Now that party officials have given the green light to the creative domains, the kind of softer creative domains, it remains to be seen whether the smaller, free-spirited micro-enterprises that are more characteristic of the creative industries and that are the crucible of idea innovation in those sectors will flourish in the same settings, or indeed whether they will be allowed to operate with the kind of independent verve we associate with liberal polities like our own that have a more fully developed civil society. Innovation in technology is one thing, but the spirit of cultural invention, as we know, is a different beast entirely. And especially in a country where very tight control is exercised over expressive content in general. So when we're talking about the China case, we have to remember that for many party bureaucrats, unleashing such unpredictable energies that come with the creative domain is sort of tantamount to opening Pandora's box. However, as long as the creative sector can be made to behave like other industries, Beijing's rulers will have nothing to worry about. The agents in those domains can be groomed and promoted in tried and true fashion to absorb foreign investment and foreign ideas, to exploit low production costs, and to incubate national champions in the domestic market and the export field. And because of the Chinese language, because of the jumbo market that is made available by the Chinese language, and because national and regional economic managers are already quite experienced in overseeing a very broad spread of industrial operations, all the way from low-level assembly operations to high-skill R&D, it's quite likely that the creative sector will be, approached and groomed and developed in much the same way as the high-tech sectors were in the 1980s and the 1990s. They may well achieve similar records of growth on the basis of a cheap labor supply and business-friendly state incentives. And if these are the outcomes, they may well affect livelihoods everywhere else, creative livelihoods everywhere else, further destabilizing the already precarious world of creative jobs. I mean, we've seen this in the case of manufacturing and to some degree white-collar and professional services. Is there any reason to think that the creative occupations will be different in terms of how they're impacted by development and growth of China's economy? Of course, the answer to that question, you can make predictions about that, but the answer to that question is not entirely resolved at this point in time. And one of the reasons is, and this is what's specific about the China case, is that China's leadership cadres have had a very gingerly approach to creative industries policy, and the main reason is because they have a very complex political understanding of the role of culture in creative expression because of the recent history going back to the Cultural Revolution in China. In the PRC, arguably more than in any other country where cultural industry policy has been developed, the debate among elites about whether to adopt it, whether to develop it, draws on conflicting experiences and histories of the post-liberation period. The Cultural Revolution is still officially remembered as a period when too much primacy was given to culture, and when the economy was put in the passenger seat. Consequently, in the reform era, watchful officials who oversee all media content in China had gotten accustomed to subordinate cultural policy to the goals of developing a market economy. And this is, obviously reflected in the composition of the leadership cadre, most of which have been, sober engineers. Mao, since the philosophically colorful rule of Mao, all of China's leaders have been sober engineers and technocrats, sworn to uphold the techno-nationalist project. And the suspicion about culture has been very intense and very deeply ingrained. The pro-democracy movement that precipitated the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989 was officially understood to have been fomented by the explosion of culture fever as it was called at the time, in the mid-1980s, when the status of the intelligentsia was fully rehabilitated, when the spectrum of publication outlets was broadened, and a new openness in the range of expressions appeared. And so these consequences serve to remind party elites, nervous party elites, of the volatile power that could be unleashed by fairly sudden shifts in cultural policy. As a result, the more conservative tendency since Tiananmen had been to restrict and therefore relegate cultural policy to the traditional domain of heritage, arts, and crafts. That's what's changed in recent years. It changed also because of marketization, of course. I mean, notwithstanding the impact of the Tiananmen crackdown, market fever had already encroached on cultural domains, and official calls for reform were sure to follow. So beginning in the 1990s, and in tandem with the push for managerial efficiency and accountability in general, what you saw was that the state-owned media, publishing and other information institutions were encouraged to reform themselves along lines very similar to the large institutions in manufacturing industries. The managers of select media organs were told to prepare themselves for the withdrawal of state subsidies. Ultimately, they were told all but the most vital propaganda organs would have to stand on their own feet. So in 2001, important landmark, the fourth session of the 9th People's Congress ratified the concept of the cultural industries. The nomenclature is very important. A lot of debate about nomenclature. 文化产业, cultural industries. This concept was ratified almost a decade after the term began to appear in internal party documents. It took several more years to ease the way for the concept, which was ultimately adopted into official nomenclature, 文化创意产业, the cultural creative industries, which is the official term. It's a kind of hybrid term, very carefully chosen as a compromise to reflect the very distinctive development gloss, known as Chinese characteristics, distinctive development gloss that is placed on all paradigms that have originated elsewhere, and that are, in other words, of foreign provenance. In the interim, the ongoing partial commercialization of state-owned media in the internet sector has been probably the most politically fraught endeavor. The government playing a highly visible game of cat and mouse with commentators who push the limits of permissible expression everywhere, mostly in regional newspapers, however, and on the web, places that are furthest from Beijing in a way, as it always has been. Compared to the Internet's porous universe of information and opinion, the prospect, the favored prospect, at least in creative industries policy making, the prospect of stable project teams of entrepreneurial individuals chasing the dragon of commercial success is actually a source of comfort to party officials. They like this idea for fairly obvious reasons. But let me spell them out. The individual appetite for self-expression is widely tolerated in China these days, as long as it avoids politically sensitive topics. I mean, most people are generally not, these days, affected in any way by censorship, I mean, not visibly and palpably, except for, intellectuals who tend, for some reason, to be drawn towards politically sensitive topics. So indeed, if this appetite for self-expression can be steered into well-regulated industrial channels, then government elites can well imagine they will have contained an otherwise volatile source of public dissidence. So this is, I suppose you could describe this as a utilitarian view of culture. And it differs very sharply from the post-liberation view of culture in the Maoist era as a pedagogical tool, and even more so from the induction of culture into a revolutionary political program of the kind that flourished in late Maoism. But political expediency is it's one of the reasons, but not the primary reason, I think, for climbing aboard the creativity bandwagon. The adoption of creative industries policy could not have arrived at a more relevant time for China's economic development, because China's march forward cannot be sustained unless it proves it can generate its own IP by jump-starting homegrown innovation rather than imitating or adapting foreign inventions. And nothing less than the honor of the nation is at stake in this intensely nationalistic nation. Boosters are never slow to mention China's historical achievements in the field of invention itself, and there's a long roll call of these, gunpowder, writing, paper, printing, compasses, abacuses, crossbows, cast iron, pendulums, seismometers, differential gears, rockets, textile spinning technology. Even in the reform era, the government can point to fledgling industrial design achievements in hard technology, in limited sectors, but certainly they're there in automobiles, white goods, and semiconductors. And of course, China has become a mecca for offshore R&D centers, employing local talent increasingly in the free trade zones in the major cities. But these initiatives are all in catch-up industries, where foreign producers are more and more accustomed to using China as a cheap offshore base. And what you find is in the cultural spheres, this offshore model is very active in old media sectors like TV and film, where Korean, Japanese, and Taiwanese product is shot and assembled cheaply on the mainland. With new media, however, it's a different story. New media presents a clean slate, as it were, a cleaner slate, and those are the domains in which China's designers are expected to enjoy a running start. Sectors like video gaming, advanced computer graphics, and multimedia communications. Online gaming, actually in China, is officially recognized as a competitive sport by the sports agency in Beijing. Online gaming, mobile media. It's a country with several 100 million cell phone users. These are already proven as very dynamic sectors, and government backing in these areas is readily available. The other important thing is that the potential for promoting cultural nationalism and limiting foreign content is very profound in the creative industries. In fact, is bottomless because of the availability of Chinese theming. Producers of multimedia genres can draw on a reservoir of several centuries of myth and legend, as well as courtly and folk narratives that are very well-known elements of the national patrimony. And you saw a lot of that, of course, in the opening ceremony of the Olympics. I mean, this is something, there's no competition in this field for Chinese historical theming. And the popular hunger for costume historical drama, not just in the PRC, but in East Asian countries generally, more or less guarantees a vast market that no one else can compete in to monopolize. While the successes of Chinese historical film epics in the West may, in the long run, prove substantial enough to work their way into the DNA of Hollywood, and I think there are already signs that that's happening. Coming in the other direction, of course, folks like Disney. Disney's only the first, probably, in a long list of entertainment majors to recognize the potential of selling Chinese-themed product and selling it back to the China market. And in fact, last year, Disney produced its first venture into localized Chinese content, a film called The Secret of the Magic Gourd, which actually was its first non-Hollywood film, I think. The company plans to develop a series of Chinese Disney characters to build on the impact of the movie, which was based on a famous Chinese children's story. Efforts like Disney's highlight the vast commercial appeal of Chinese theming. In addition, the economic significance of cultural heritage is now being fully realized in the tourism industry, where sites from the feudal past are marketed as spiritual anchors of the national culture. This emphasis has a very marked political dimension that won't be visible or legible to most tourists, however. Foreign tourists, it's largely the legacy of the Deng and Jiang eras, when something called socialist spiritual civilization was promoted heavily as an antidote to the urge for money-making in the Reform era. Restoring the people's access to China's rich heritage traditions was endowed with a nationalist stamp that had equally been applied, almost with the same kind of zeal, in the Cultural Revolution's anti-feudalist goals of encouraging modern traditions. So it's a complete reversal of the Cultural Revolution's approach towards feudal traditions. So the development of these tourist sites, which are also a very important part of creative industries in China, along with the investments in costume drama theming, fulfill a number of government needs that are very important. Growth in GDP, foreign exchange earnings, and domestic consumerism. But also, they speak to a mode of citizen formation that is steeped in Neo-Confucian sentiment, which is a very important part of the mix here. So traditional stories and myths, reworked as safe commentary in contemporary politics, are a relatively stable commodity, easy to drop into an industrial product cycle and serve up for consumer demand. And if IPR regulation can ever be properly implemented in China, then this heritage domain may have a sustainable future. But what about the more idiosyncratic and unpredictable initiatives that are more characteristic of Western paradigms of creativity and originality? Can China's and this is the kind of question that Keane, I think, tries to address in his book, which I think was part of the readings for the group. Can China's policymakers afford to accommodate, let alone stimulate, offbeat expression that is quite out of step with Beijing-approved content? I think that the question actually that's more pressing for mainland Chinese themselves is, and this is a test of national pride in many ways, is whether Chinese creativity can be labored into being in the teeth of long-standing Orientalist stereotypes about the static and derivative nature of Chinese society. How creative can Chinese people be within the PRC itself, within mainland China itself? And a lot of the anxiety about this question revolves around how national elites are trying to introduce changes in the educational system, which is perceived to be the major constraint or native constraint on dynamic thinking. These perceived deficiencies in the education system, which is heavily imbued with the Confucian ethos of learning through copying. Traditional learning in the form of repetitive drills and rote memorization has always been in China deemed conducive to an obedient citizenry and a disciplined workforce capable of following orders, of replicating other cultures. But national elites now consider this ethos to be an obstacle to the task of stimulating innovation and creativity. So let me just conclude by summarizing that, or observing rather, that while creative industry policy in China has been introduced in line with market and neoliberal imperatives, the officials who are involved in this are far from persuaded that the concept brings with it no baggage from the culture wars. I mean, the culture wars, not only in China itself, is a legacy of the Cultural Revolution, but also culture wars from overseas. And that is why the policy, in part, is one of selective quarantine and not wholesale endorsement or exposure. It's one thing for the government to acknowledge or perhaps even hail the overseas successes of Chinese film, or Chinese art for that matter, which has been the target of a frenzy, international frenzy in buying among collectors in the last few years. But there's one thing to do that, but unlimited consumption, domestic consumption of these same products is not officially encouraged any more than consumption of foreign films is encouraged. And consumption of foreign films is still officially restricted to 20 films a year. Officially, you're only supposed to be able to watch 20 foreign films a year. I mean, that policy basically ensures massive, widespread piracy. It's that policy alone that guarantees that in China. Most party cadres would prefer that the cultural industry's the creative industry's policy of sending culture to the market be concentrated in the export field, lest the ghosts of the past, which are buried in a very shallow grave in China, make an unwelcome return. So that I think is what I would just conclude by pointing to as, you know, the specific Chinese characteristics of the adoption of the policy there.
Well, I can start by, it's working. I can start by saying that there's probably no Latin American country that resembles the Chinese case, not even Cuba. It's just so different. I mean, from the whole question of discouraging foreign film consumption, it's totally unregulated. There's no, and even if there were regulations, they're never followed. So the most consumption of film that you find in most Latin American countries, or in all Latin American countries, is U.S. film, or transnationally produced films. Let me just begin by saying that the concern for developing culture industries, there was never too much of an effort until two particular moments in Latin America. And I'm generalizing, not all countries have the same speed, have the same issues. But the first moment would be the 1980s, where a series of countries make a transition from dictatorships to democracy. And there's a groundswell of civil society movements that put a set of issues onto the agenda. In the case of Chile, film was controlled, film and television were controlled. People could still get around it when Brunet was in charge of that, but nevertheless, it was, along with other issues, going to be opened up in a country like that. But the civil society movements and human rights movements did not target culture or creative industries, at least not in the way that we understand it. Certainly not creative industries, and certainly cultural industries not in the way we're looking at them now. The moment at which some countries begin to really get concerned, or see some officials and some intellectuals in these countries begin to get concerned about this for the first time seriously in the recent period. I'm not talking about the 30s when there were such things as protectionist measures, but recently is in Mexico with the impending NAFTA, right? And you get a series of analyses that are concerned about what are going to be the effects of the opening up of Mexican markets to the book industry, to the film industry was already, but nevertheless, Mexico did produce a lot more films before the end of the 90s by the time NAFTA had an effect. I think sometime around 98 or 99, after a period in the 70s or 80s where they were producing 80 to 90 films, in 98 or 99, there were 11 films produced, for example. So there was a concern with the effects of NAFTA in certain sectors. There was a book published in 1992 by Nestor Garcia Conclini and a series of other people that looked at the effect on education, on textbook publishing, on the film industry, on the music industry, so on and so forth. The other pole of, let's say, where trade and regional integration policies become a concern are in Mercosur, where there are initiatives for policies, including regional policies, that never get anywhere. All right, there are a lot of documents created, but no effective force behind any of them. Although one could say that one of the areas in which that, particularly in the case of audiovisual, there had been some movement was in co-productions, particularly in relationship to Spain, Ibermedia when that was created, and some other initiatives with Europe. But outside of that, within the countries themselves, there was no, within those regional arrangements, there was very little in the early 90s in terms of really getting production out there. So this is a first moment of concern, and largely government, national governments were not very attuned. It took a lot of work on the part of a lot of these intellectuals to try to get things like culture industries and later creative industries onto an agenda to get politicians to listen to that. That generated a spate of economic impact analyses. You figure that the only way we're going to be able to convince these people that culture matters is to show that, for example, in Mexico, the first study was 6.7% of the gross national product is, this was done according to a U.S. framework rather than creative industries. It was intellectual property-based industries. And that was done by a fellow named Ernesto Piedras. He replicated that model in Guatemala, and there was a competing model, which was the one that was bequeathed through the Convenio Andrés Bello, which is a UNESCO-like organization that's sited in Colombia, that has its headquarters in Colombia, and that and 12 countries belong to it. And they began doing economic impact studies either of all the culture industries or of specific sectors in first all the Andean countries and then extending beyond the Andean countries. So we have a couple of different methodologies and approaches to measuring economic impact of the culture and creative industries. In the case of Colombia itself, particularly Bogotá, it was not Colombia-wide, it was Bogotá. There were two studies done in Colombia, one for Bogotá, one for Cartagena. Bogotá, it was the creative industries using exactly the mapping documents and all the input from the British Council. In the case of Cartagena, it was a study of the music industry. So this is a first movement, and as I already mentioned earlier, there is, or at least I think yesterday, some, at least in the case of the Convenio Andrés Bello, an initial input from experience outside. Not only the British Council, but also a set of Catalonian, Spanish, but especially Catalonian cultural policymakers with a track record in Catalonia and in Spain on measuring, promoting policies, so on and so forth. I should say that Brazil, this is usually the case with Brazil, has a dynamism of its own. It's the largest country, it has the largest economy, and early on, Brazil instituted not exactly a clone of a U.S. model, but it was the first country to institute fiscal incentives to drive the culture industries. First, an audiovisual law, and then an other law, an audiovisual incentive law, and then another one that would be able to, for which people in the book industry, the music industry, so on and so forth, would be able to get subsidies. It's one of those, unlike the U.S. Fiscal incentive laws, it has a ceiling. And of course, one of the problems there is that some initiatives, like the Guggenheim in Rio, threaten to use up almost all the resources because we're talking about a $200 million project. And I think at that moment, the exact ceiling of the fiscal incentive law was about $200 million, which is one of the reasons why there was a groundswell of opposition to one of the many reasons to the Guggenheim project. What you begin to see in Latin America is some version of, without the same formation of public-private relations, a lot of incentives, a lot of promotion of public-private initiatives in the cultural field. All right, from Chile all the way up to Mexico. So one could see that without necessarily buying whole hook, line, and sinker into a neoliberal regime, the incentives which put a lot of the dynamism in the private sector, since it was the private sector that would partner with a particular cultural producer, right? It all depended on who could get that private funding. And the money would come from government, which is kind of really perverse. It's a law that over time has been amended to try to fix some of those perversities. But there was a lot of promotion of the public-private sector, sometimes in relationship with the third sector. Nevertheless, despite some of this activity, government, ministries, still largely focused on heritage and museums. It was still like the main dish of cultural policy. And to this day, when you look at how much money is disbursed from within cultural ministries, since these are already existing entities, a lot of the money goes in that direction. The other issue that, along these lines, that one finds in several countries is a series of culture industries incubators. So again, some of the foreign consultants who already have a track record in incubators, right, will establish poles of this in areas where local governments, as in the case of Bogota, begin to promote design, fashion, architecture, so on and so forth. And so you do find a couple of cities where there is a creative industries model. In Brazil, which is quite interesting, there isn't a coherent model of what's going to happen with IP. I think we've discussed this before. There are different sectors that are promoting IP harmonization, and others, and very strongly within the non-commercial, or at least the non-large commercial enterprises. For example, Global, the major network, is an agent that promotes IP laws, implementation of IP laws. But there's a whole area that's quite interesting that's outside of policy, but that with the Gilberto Gil ministry began to get interested in, which is a lot of production that takes place in the informal sector without necessarily seeking to formalize as companies, so on and so forth, that sector. And a discovery that there were modes of production in that informal sector that actually produced a lot. There were measurements of the music industry in a city in the north, Belém, that produces a music called Tecnobrega. Brega means like kitschy music, right? Like pop balladeers. And Tecnobrega is a techno version of that kitschy music. But it's a music that produces about 6 million reais in that region, largely through concerts, but also by producing the records, the CDs, with the pirates. Since, and this is something that's very important, since within the economy of Brazil, given the income, most people are going to go to pirates to buy their music anyway. Obviously, the musicians find that it's much better to sell in the pirate areas than in stores where they're going to get fewer people buying. So, and it's particularly among their fans. I'm talking about Tecnobrega is similar to some other experiences like the reggae sound systems, like the champeta in Cartagena, so on and so forth. So there's quite a large economy in that area. And the Ministry of Culture, with the input of certain actors that had been prominent in television and the music industry, began to promote research in these, what they call new business, alternative business models. and to actually foster them. So whether it's technobrega or funk, which follows a similar mode of production, or other such musics, you get that. There's also similar business models, if you want to call them that, in Buenos Aires with a music called, what's it called? The cumbia villera. Cumbia villera. So throughout Latin America, and there's probably in other areas that I'm not familiar with, very similar systems. And of course, that brings into discussion the whole question of IP, copyright. And it's something where, from within the Ministry of Culture and many of its advisors, they've gone, basically, Gilberto Gil himself made a pact with Creative Commons to promote these alternative licensing. All right? And this is at least Ministry of Culture policy. There are initiatives afoot in other countries, but no other country has so officially endorsed that uptake of Creative Commons as in the case of Brazil. I said that in some places where there isn't the kind of dynamism that you find in China or even in Brazil, the orientation has been towards cultural tourism. Some countries like Costa Rica or Mexico have a very large tourism industry and are seeking then to integrate different kinds of cultural expression, whether it's local heritage or new media versions of it, into the culture industries. But there is no, let's say, no dynamism towards a new model in those areas, with perhaps the exception of Costa Rica, which has a high-tech sector and is at this moment seeking to create a large center for the promotion of the creative industries, with video gaming, so on and so forth, in this particular sector in San Jose. But that's only because there's already an already existing high-tech sector, which is unlike any other Central American country or even Colombia or Venezuela. We have a very different reality, which deserves mentioning within this globalized circuit, of a country like El Salvador that sees its cultural production dependent upon migrants, the 2 million who live in the United States and who send remittances and who have altered the cultural ecology of El Salvador, and who basically see that that all cultural tourism really depends on migrants who go back and visit. Not only send remittances, but so there's what they call a nostalgia and ethnic cultural tourism, and the production of cultural products that get exported to the United States to service those migrants in the United States. In the case of Mexico, unlike the case of Brazil, Fox First, who was not as bad, believe it or not, as Calderon, has basically slashed the budgets of the culture ministry, has undone some of the cultural industries initiatives that were begun under Fox, and to which a lot of effort was put. So Mexico is really not the dynamo that it could be, given that it's outpaced Brazil in its actual value of its economic impact of cultural production. But it's not the dynamo that one would imagine in this case. And finally, and we're short on this, Miami, in a sense, is the Hong Kong that belongs to no Latin American nation, and no Latin American nation is able to rein back into Latin America, but to which, beginning in the 90s, first the majors in music and several television companies, particularly from Mexico and Venezuela, moved and established headquarters. All right? At the same time, drawing some of the most treasured and valued executives in the culture industries from Argentina, from Venezuela, from Mexico, from Brazil, so on and so forth, creating in Miami a very dynamic sector for the production of music, television, a lot of the telenovelas. It's even altered some of the mode of production of telenovelas where the characters no longer are national, right? So you don't just get a Venezuelan telenovela or a Mexican telenovela, but you get a generic Latin American telenovela coming out of Miami. And similar things have happened in the arts sector, where the diaspora, the Cuban diaspora, strengthened, gave a shot in the arm. Almost by now, the entire 1980s, the most visible generation of artists, the young British artists, or the young Cuban artists, in this case, of the 1980s, some moved directly to Miami, others went to Mexico and then to Miami, and began to put Miami on the map of contemporary art. It already had a fine arts market, to the point that Miami became a contemporary art center. And in the year 2000, Art Basel sought to locate and put its second fair in Miami. And since then, that has spawned the growth of a large arts district called Wyndham for contemporary arts. It's sort of the Soho with all the warehouses along a 2-mile stretch of 100 or more galleries that actually really benefit from in terms of sales and a lot of the events. Since Art Basel situates a lot of its events in all of the galleries, they benefit from it. So there is a direct relationship between some of the economic problems that Miami has had, that Latin America has had, and the siting of some of these headquarters or the opening up of certain venues like museums for the outflow of many talented people going to there are some indications that there are some changes afoot. And that has to do with what you could call the new left in Latin America, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil. It's hard to, I've evidently put Chile in that category, but there's not a coherence in that. What is interesting is that Venezuela did open a cultural ministry in 2005 and has begun to seriously put money into the culture industries, and particularly into initiatives like Telesur, seeking to provide an alternative to CNN, so on and so forth. But it's not clear yet where this is going, particularly because countries like Ecuador and Bolivia, and even Venezuela, are in flux right now, and it's too early to predict what are the effects of left governments in these countries in terms of culture industries or creative industries. I'll leave it there.